you could look, so that would be every new case that comes into the clinic for example. You could look at all cases diagnosed in a sampled population. So go look in a particular community and look for the cases there. There's some other examples that you could, I guess, read through. So the measure of association that is used in a case control study is an odds ratio. And it's sort of depicted here in a 2x2 table. So all of your people in your study can be put into one of these boxes. So they're either a case or they're a control, and then they've either been exposed or not. So you'll have numbers in each of these boxes, and then you can calculate a ratio. So in the cases, the proportion of cases that have been exposed would be A over A plus C. So these are the cases that are exposed, and this is the total number of cases. Proportion of controls would be this number over this number. The odds is different than proportion. So the odds of exposure of cases would be A to C, so 1 to 2, or it could be 1 to 1. And then you calculate this ratio. So this is an example we could look at. So if our question was about food poisoning, so we have here 20 people who went to a party. Some of them got food poisoning, some of them didn't. So we have 7 people that got food poisoning, 13 people that didn't, and we're suspicious that it was the pudding that might have caused this food poisoning. So if we look among our 7 sick people, 5 of them ate the pudding, 2 of them didn't. If we look at the people who didn't get sick, 3 of them ate the pudding, 10 of them didn't. So if we were going to calculate an odds ratio here, we do what is the odds ratio, so the odds of exposure among our sick people. The odds of exposure are 5 to 2, because we had 5 people that were exposed, 2 people that weren't. And our odds of exposure in the controls, we had 3 people exposed, 10 unexposed. So if we do that calculation, we get 8.3. So we'd summarize that as saying that our cases, so the people who were sick, were 8.3 times more likely to have eaten the pudding or to have been exposed to it. So that's a very simplified example. Is that kind of clear? We'll look at more examples, but. So when you see an odds ratio, if the odds ratio is 1, that means there's no association. So it was equally likely that your cases and controls were exposed to whatever you're looking at. Assuming statistical significance, which we'll talk about next, if your odds ratio is greater than 1, it means that this exposure is a potential risk factor. So your cases are more likely to have been exposed. So an odds ratio of 2 would be interpreted as exposure is twice as likely in your cases versus your controls. If your odds ratio is less than 1, then that suggests it's a protective factor. So an odds ratio of 0.5 would be interpreted as saying exposure was half as likely in cases versus controls. So in my case, when I'm looking at breastfeeding and asthma, if I find an odds ratio of 0.5, it would mean that the breastfed kids are half as, or the kids with asthma are half as likely to have been breastfed. So we look at the above 1 and below 1, but almost always we never get exactly 1. We're going to be a little bit below or a little bit above, but we want to know if that's significant. So that's normally done using confidence intervals. So a 95% confidence interval is calculated, and what it tells us is that we're 95% confident or certain that our true measure of effects or odds ratio lies between this range. So if our odds ratio that we calculate, for example, is 5.95 and our confidence interval is 4.05 to 7.23, means we're 95% confident that the true difference, because we're always just estimating, is in that range. And if that range does not cross 1, then it's statistically significant. So in this case, we're 95% certain that the odds of chili pepper consumption was between 4 and 7.23 times more likely in our cases, and our estimate is 5.95. So this is significant because it doesn't cross 1. If the odds ratio, and we'll look at some more examples, but if it crossed 1, so if it was like 0.8 to 7 or 0.8 even to 1.2, that includes 1, so that means it's not significant. Odds ratios can be crude or adjusted. You'll often see that in papers, and we'll look at some examples. So a crude odds ratio is sort of what we just calculated. We just looked at our exposure and our outcome. We got 8.3. That's our crude odds ratio. but with statistical modeling, we can adjust those odds ratios for other factors that we think might be influencing the relationship. So, for example, a common one is to adjust for age and sex. So here we have the same sort of question, or chili pepper consumption associated with cancer. Once we adjust for age and sex, we have this new odds ratio. It's a little bit less, it's 5.49, but this confidence interval is still significant. It's still not crossing 1. So this adjustment is a way of controlling for other factors, or variables, or covariates, you might hear them called. So in this example, we did a case control study about folic acid supplementation during pregnancy and looked at development of autism, and we calculated this odds ratio. So an odds ratio of 1.11 with a confidence interval of 0.45 to 1.57. Would you conclude that folic acid is a risk factor for autism, protective factor, or that there's no significant association? No, right? Because that crosses 1. Example 2. So we have looking at green tea and esophageal cancer, odds ratio of 0.79. Constant confidence interval is shown there. So would this be evidence of a risk factor, protective factor, or no association? Protective, yeah. So the odds are lower of getting cancer if you're drinking green tea, and it doesn't cross 1, so that's significant. Good. You guys are great. So this is a study, breastfeeding, it's one of my favorite topics. So looking at breastfeeding and diarrheal disease in a case control study. So here are some results from that study, looking at cases and controls and the prevalence of different potential risk factors in those babies. So which of the following, based on this table, you can see, is a significant risk factor for diarrheal disease? So male gender, renting a private accommodation, mixed feeding, formula feeding, or all of the above. Formula, yeah. So of all those factors, that's the only one that's significant. We have here male gender. So here we have male as the reference, female as the exposure, but it's not significant, so this crosses 1. We have the renting again. Renting a council accommodation is a significant risk factor, but a private accommodation was not significant. And here we have the feeding, so they've set exclusive breast milk as 1 as the reference category. Then we have here mixed feeding, not significant, but formula feeding, over 3 times increased risk of diarrheal disease. So formula.
Can you explain the ones that they're setting to 1?
Yeah, so for each comparison, you have to set a reference group. Okay. And the reference is always 1, so compared to an odds ratio of 1, which is no difference, what's the change in the other factor. So for each factor that you're examining, and that's up to you in your model, you can decide. You could flip it and say, I want females to be the reference group, and I'll look at the risk associated with, or the odds associated with being male. And that's a choice that you can make. It would be this exact same p-value, but it would be kind of the opposite odds ratio. Good question. Other questions? Pretty clear to everyone? Okay. In this table, just as an aside, it doesn't say anywhere that they've adjusted for anything, so I would say that these are crude odds ratios. So here, from the same paper, is the adjusted odds ratios. So in the adjusted analyses, which of these things would be true? Mixed feeding is a significant risk factor for diarrheal disease for infants less than 6 months only. So here they've done adjusted and also stratified. So they're looking at infants less than 6 months, infants over 6 months, and then all infants. Expressed breast milk protects against diarrheal disease in infants over 6 months. Infants over 6 months who are formula fed are 4.49 times more likely to develop a diarrheal disease. I'll give you a minute. So why did you pick that?
So the mixed feeding less than 6 months crosses 1,
Right.
so not significant. And then EBM in greater than 6 months, the odds ratio was 4.49, so 4.4 times more likely to develop diarrhea compared to EBM, because EBM is the reference. So I thought that was true. And then C, greater than or greater than, or sorry, that was C. EBM protects against diarrheal disease in infants greater than 6 months. Wow. I know which way. I don't understand. That's the one I know.
I don't understand B. I don't know why he's.
So here, it's a matter of kind of like you asked about what's the reference group. So if we're saying that expressed breast milk is the reference group, and we see that formula feeding is an increased risk, so you can flip that and say, compared to formula feeding, expressed breast milk feeding is protective. And that was true only in the over 6 months group, because here these associations are not significant.
I have a question about, I know like the last slide was crude matched odds and this is adjusted matched odds. The match, what are they matching?
So I think if you look back at the, I don't know if it says in the abstract, but they may have matched on some specific things like gestational age, or not these factors they wouldn't have been matched on, but other factors. So in their study design.
So, and then, so each case of diarrheal illness would have been matched to another case?
Yeah, so they would go and find a case of diarrheal illness, and then they're interested in milk feeding, so they wouldn't match on milk feeding, but they might say, oh, it's important to match on like neighborhood socioeconomic status. So they would find another child from that same neighborhood who did not get diarrheal disease as a control. And they get a series of pairs like that, and then they would say, if we look at all our cases versus all our controls, are there differences in feeding?
Okay. So each, like the table is made up of a series of pairs, even though you don't see the pairs compared to each other?
Yeah.
Okay.
So just so I get this right, so to the reference group, so like when we're flipping the, like, so how we got to each of the odds ratios, like, say going back to the EBM, like the way it's structured with EBM being the reference group, it would have been like the odds of being formula fed and having diarrhea over the odds of being EBM fed.
Yeah, so here it would be the odds of being formula fed in the cases versus controls is 4.49 times higher than the odds of being formula fed in, so the odds of being formula fed is 4.49 times higher, and that's comparing the cases to the control.
Oh, the ones with diarrhea.
With diarrhea, yeah.
So then, and then if we're flipping the reference group,
So if you were to flip it and say, well, let's make formula as a reference group, then you'd get an estimate for, sorry, I'm using my pen. If you made this the reference group, set this to 1, then you would get quite a low odds here, so like maybe it'd be 0.2 or something. So an 80% reduced risk of diarrhea if you're EBM versus formula. And then this would be somewhere in the middle.
but the calculation itself doesn't match.
So then we would, instead of doing,
It just depends what's on the right side of the table versus the left
yeah,
side of the table.
so if, in that case, it's sort of like, is formula your exposure or is breastfeeding your exposure? So which way do you want?
Oh, I see.
With the B, sorry, I'm so, I understand the flip, that makes sense to me. But each of the, so all the way into 6 months, there's different categories, and there's some that are mixed, which is not significant. But then there's some that are significant, and that statement to me is a very sweeping one. So can you say that?
So, okay, EBM protects against diarrheal disease.
We're saying it does protect, but then if you look at any breast milk, that was significant. Like positively protected. But then the one above it is mixed. It's not significant. So like I don't know, unless all of those are significant, I don't know if I would go so far as to say it is fully.
Protected. I guess you could argue, I mean, I would say probably for this one, I'd look at this where it's EBM or not EBM.
I think that's where I was looking.
And you've got
when I
this as,
Yeah,
yeah,
again, if we look at one of them, that's a reasonable statement, but if
But
we're
if you
saying
look
it
at
across
the
the board, then all of them should be significant. I feel.
all of them, like all of these different
Anytime
categories.
EBM was used, which would include that mixed category.
Yeah, so I guess you could say compared to formula feeding, it's significant compared to mixed feeding.
So I know this is like splitting hairs,
No,
but at
that's
the same
a
time,
good discussion.
it's kind of the line of
I
splitting.
think because I was a little confused as to these different ones they had on the left. Right?
So this is in,
Like why they, like
So-
the top one is EVM mixed formula and the second one is any breast milk, no breast milk. And then the last one's EVM, not EVM.
so here they've classified it in different ways.
Yeah.
So to make different comparisons. So if you just said any versus none, that's one way of looking at breast milk.
Yeah.
Here, exclusive versus not exclusive.
Yeah.
So in this
So I
case,
guess because of the questions.
yeah.
Then you
Then you look down.
But I understand.
But yeah, because the top one had it too.
Wait, wouldn't you say because of the middle
But
one,
the top one
if
is the
any
middle.
breast milk was protective in infants greater than 6 months, EBM would be protective?
So like if we said EVM, no formula, EVM, like I'm just splitting here, but
I would say, so in infants greater than 6 months, any breast milk looks to be protective.
Yes.
This is and exclusive breast milk is also.
or like not, but then if it's, yeah.
All right, let's continue. But we can chat more about it. Right?
Oh, are they defining EVM as exclusive breast milk then? Rather than
I thought it was any breast milk.
then express one?
EBM is, yeah, exclusive.
So then that would answer your question, because EVM is then exclusive breast milk. It's not mixed with breast.
So then the next category of any breast milk. So we're not counting that as EVM because it's possible to open breast milk.
No, because
Possible
it's mixed and EVM together.
Mixed would be formula and breast milk.
Oh, I get the mix, but
It doesn't mean express, it just means exclusive. And so in the bottom, E is EVM exclusive, so you have to be exclusive.
I've always thought it meant express.
That's how I got too, but if you look at the bottom of their table.
It depends on the study. That's also,
And I take back my splitting hairs.
Okay.
Spot on. But I was like, because that's what we do, that's how we use it in the
no, you're right, and then you.
Okay. They're just using
All
it
right,
as.
continuing on.
Sorry.
So some pros and cons of case control studies. Advantages, you often need smaller sample sizes than surveys or cohorts. So if you can go and make sure you find all the food allergy kids, you don't have to survey a big, huge population to find them. They can be quick, easy, and cost effective. That's always relative, but because you go and find your cases, you ask them about their history, that's pretty quick. They can be very useful for studies of rare diseases. If you go in for a tumor registry, for example, to find the kids with cancer, that's a lot easier than just surveying the general population. You won't find many cases. Limitations are that they provide an indirect estimate of risk. So that's sort of a technicality, but we're looking at the odds of exposure, not the actual risk of new disease development, because we're not looking at it that way. Those are often in a good approximation of each other, but not always. The timing is difficult still to determine. So what came first? If you're still one snapshot in time, you're asking about prior exposures, but that can be tricky. Representativeness of cases and controls is often unknown. So how well do your cases or your controls represent the overall population can be questionable. So activity before we take a break. Think about your question and how you might design a case control study to address it. How would you define your cases and how would you select your controls?
So, our topic is
Yeah, so I guess our outcomes
You probably doing one clinic.
Or look at that. Like go back to mine.
You could ask them about,
And then, so it would be someone else in the community that knows the
actually maybe, so let's say we do a 10-minute break. Is 10 minutes long enough? So you can talk about your ideas on your break if you want to have coffee or something. And we'll meet back in 10 minutes.
We'll have two independent conversations. Yeah. See if we can have the same time. Ooh, that's good.
I had coffee this morning and then I went after you left and I went at lunch. You hanging out. So it's like a lot of coffee.
Okay. This place is beautiful. It's
My son is right.
Yeah, no, I keep leaving. Keeps ahead, like coming from ahead.
I had no idea about the expressed versus exclusive. But it's normally expressed, right?
Yeah.
although when I
didn't either see that, but I noticed on the like table there at the very bottom it
So I was
had
like,
this
but
note
To say that
that it was like EDM equals exclusive breastfeeding, and I was like, that's why.
you know, as soon as that clicked in, I was like, oh, well, then you can totally say that. But I was like,
Yeah.
otherwise, you can't say that. That's a sweet experience. Still recording. Take it first.
No, everyone's.
I'm not good at taking pictures.
Let's see.
I can put that on my hobbies. My wedding photographer also took this photo, which was my crimes photo, which was like my favorite photo.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And this one wasn't even the one I was planning on using for clients. I had like another one where I was wearing a blazer that looked more professional, but this one had like the
Looked more
really
like you.
awesome smile and just felt more like me.
I actually, the one I used, it was the same. The one I used, I actually wear jeans now. Jeans.
You actually like to go.
I'm definitely not wearing a blazer or anything. So it'll just
It's not bad. This is what it kind of has.
See, this is the one I was gonna use.
Oh, I definitely like that one. It's
But
more, it's like a
This
relief
one's
smile.
like more t-shirt. Oh, it's super cute.
Same thing, though, it was like no blazer.
Yeah.
Google Maps. How'd you get to, where's this place called tonight?
Late Manitoba.
Suzanne, can't do so much stuff.
Yes, you can.
You say everything's crazy. I try to interpret it as you know where you're going.
Okay, Brianne knows where we're going, and Brianne is notorious for
Okay, I'll look at it before we.
I'll do it now. It's fine. So, maps.
Are you saying you have no faith in Brianna?
Directions. Directions? Absolutely not.
To be fair, it takes us to.
Uh,
2 hours and 2 minutes. Oh, it's up there. Holy. Put your singing voice on.
Have my license.
I don't know. You had to go to Portage fast. Couldn't even do it in the big city. So we're just taking scheduled minutes. Oh dear Lord. Well, so you want us to go to the cinema, then?
Oh, I see.
my issue. If I don't work out early in the day, by the time I get home from work, I'm like, that's the last thing I want to do.
Unless it's
But
like,
it clears your head and gives you like a second wind.
No.
like skating or something that you have to go and you pay for and then you'll get in trouble if you don't go, then it doesn't matter what it is. But if it's just me by myself.
But do you have a gym you're going? No, I've got
What campus do we get?
We have a gym.
So I am kind of set, but these are not workouts.
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
access.
We're talking about the audience. What can I go with other? Medical expert. No, I was picked up communication. I feel like I always just
Are they pretty much subsidizing? Like how much of this is being subsidized?
Probably a good amount, 'cause they're like, yeah. Although they talk about it in there.
Yeah, think about this like 4, there's like,
NRP, running thing, right?
yeah.
Is it just a form, what do we do?
So our website, there's 2 forms. One
Is
is,
it specific NRP?
no, you just form for like we're submitting a course. So you submit the course, but because it's your first time going, it's the extra form you have to send in a void check.
Oh, so I can do
So they give you and so I did the void check, but I did all of their email. So I just like, I have a scanner on my, I have like a scanner on my iPad where you just take a picture and it scans it, PDF, makes a PDF, green. And then you go and you
That's
just,
a very form.
yeah, it's the our website. And it actually gives you the full amount back.
It could be any course.
Yep.
Really?
And then you need this is your first claim, you need a void check in this, but then you need the expense. So this you only have to do once, and this one, you have to give the certificate of completion, the receipt of the course payment, and fill out form. It's when you go on, if you go on to, when you go onto the website, the NFP website, your receipt should be there as well, when you pay. Like when you initially paid, it should be downloaded.
do that. I also need to fill out my Form B so that I don't have to start paying my unregistered student loan.
What, you don't have to pay it?
Not the provincial one. We have to start paying the federal one, but the provincial
Oh.
one, you don't have to pay till you're done licensing.
Nova Scotia does that if you.
And no interest on it.
That is so lucky.
Yeah.
BC is amalgamated with Canada,
Yeah.
and so I was getting charged on July 1st, 7.5% interest.
Well, and then
So
my
I paid
federal
that
loan,
immediately.
I paid out with my line of credit.
Yeah, so-
So it's on my line of
But
credit.
then line of credit, interest rate went up.
Oh, did it?
It went up 0.35.
Oh, I remember that, yeah.
Because then it may go.
Isn't it going up again?
Yeah, the banks haven't released it. It may not go up with it,
It's
but
still not gonna go up to the same percentage.
it won't go up to
Federal
that percent,
loan.
but it's going up higher and higher. Did you trust me?
No.
Watching that. Get like a hawk.
I was actually going to come back last month. Thanks.
See, so I calculated it, if I put $5,000 to my line of credit, my interest to save for the month is like $3. So it makes more sense for me to put $5,000 in my TFSA, because I'll make like $8.
What's the exposure?
And it's like, so it's better, but if you,
We didn't calculate everything out, so my interest rate on my line of credit, I thought was lower
We
than
did say
any of my
physician visit
savings accounts, so we put all of our savings into one.
yeah, but if your TFSA might make
I don't
similar,
have a TFSA.
you should open it up
They're not
now.
their own.
Put $50 in it, and you can do, you have to go to a bank to open it, it's a tax-free savings account, just like you shepherd money.
Yeah.
Open it up now, you should put all of your savings per year, because ever since your age of 18, you plus 5,500, 1 year was time when Harper was there, so up to now, we can put like $45,000 there, and then you can take that money, you invest it in stocks, that kind of thing, later on,
the only way
and then the profit you get back, they can't tax you. And that's all I'm starting it now, and then it's better for you to take that money.
Out of it. I don't know that much about it, though, and Andrew does all the finance, he understands all of it, but he doesn't have a TFSA because he's also an American citizen right now, and so if he does a TFSA, then he has to pay like American tax or there's some
something
weird
like that, yeah.
Seems like you would just be like,
Which is why he
I'm gonna do this, but also in case you want for later or
And
whatever.
you should, instead of paying that money to line credit, put your TFSA, and then by the.
Okay, guys, let's start.
And like lower.
Start with
And then when you're
concussion group.
done with residency, you can come back.
That's great.
Yeah.
Tell us your case control design.
Sure, so our case control would be, so cases would be kids, we're gonna stick with minor hockey, kids who had concussion, and we'll do teenagers, so like 12 to 17, 13 to 17. Our cases were kids who had concussions in the past season, and our controls were ones who did not. And so we would match them based on age and BMI, and then look at differences in terms of level being played, their birth months, if that made a difference irrespective of BMI, and level of play. So
Okay.
of kids the same age, if they're playing at a higher level, if that would be.
Because the higher levels have more hitting and stuff.
Or like is higher skill protective, or is higher skill mean that you're being hit harder by other players?
Okay, so it could go either way. So you're matching on age and BMI, meaning that you're not interested in those as, that's not what you're interested in looking at, you just want to control for those. Good. Okay, fish group.
I'm mysterious. Okay. So we said that we're going to use our question as like is being exposed to fish prior to 12 months correlated with increased allergies. So our outcome is fish allergy in a Gen Peds clinic, and then our exposure is a self-reported introduction of fish either before or after 12 months.
Okay, so you'd ask the parents or?
Yeah.
And who would your controls be?
Well, other patients and other guys.
So just patients that don't have fish allergy but are part of it.
Exactly.
Anyone in university currently, and then matching them to people from those communities who don't have a university degree, if that was our measure, which I don't think is really the best measure of those, that's okay. And matching by age, sex, and location, and then seeing how they.
So your cases would be like people who didn't graduate?
Cases
Who
would
did?
be kids who, let's say did, but I guess didn't, either one or the other. So we're either actively in university currently or graduated, which is either. And then comparing them to the controls people who didn't go past like high school education from their communities, similar age and sex. And then either through asking them more work histories, they would find out.
I think in my mind, for your question, I would do the outcome as like the poor achievement, not graduating, just because if you look for people who did graduate, that's almost different. So probably finding the people who didn't is the hard part. Find them and then find people who matches.
So in that case, depending on if you wanted to do communities, case control studies, you could pick a set number of years of kids graduating from high school and then follow up with that cohort, which isn't really going backwards, but like say looking at school records is who graduated 5 years ago, and then seeing who went to university and who didn't, and using those.
Okay, so looking at, because people would have moved from their community, do you think?
Well, after for school you do go away. So that way it can be easier to compare.
I think
High school graduation, dropouts, and then retrospectively go back to
or even something, so not graduating high school is like an extreme condition, but you might even look earlier, like grade 3 test scores or something, and that might be an earlier place to catch it, right? That might be hard to do.
We were trying to follow our previous plan, post-secondary.
Right, yes.
Or else, yeah, it would be totally easier to just change our measure and then,
Okay, and James, did you join this group?
I did, yeah. Hi, sorry. So we were birth control and so our case teenage girls who became pregnant or who were currently pregnant, and then our controls, we thought we should match them to like their like similar age peers, maybe like the attendees of like a teen health clinic or like their like neighborhood or like school cohort, and then you could match them for neighborhood socioeconomic status, level of education completed, like in terms of like what grade. You could also like go as far as test scores, and then your like exposure would be like, and we also had like ask like religion or like religiosity, and then your exposure would be like received like prenatal counseling or like received prescription for birth control, so like either like coding and like at a physician visit of like family planning or contraception, or like having like a government prescription for either one as like the single exposure. Right? Cases of pregnancy versus controls is not pregnant.
So looking to see if the girls who'd gotten pregnant compared to the controls had less use or less prescriptions for the.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So, go through these quickly. So as an example of stomach ulcers, we could have a question, is coffee a risk factor for stomach ulcers, as we all so an ecologic study to do that would be to look at coffee consumption rates and stomach ulcer rates in different countries. So do countries where coffee is consumed more have more levels of stomach cancer? Or you could look at a trend. So if coffee consumption rates have changed over time, if they've increased over time, have stomach ulcers also increased over that same period of time? At a cross-sectional level, you could use, I mentioned the Canadian Community Health Survey. So in that survey, people are asked to report on different health conditions. If stomach ulcers are one of the things mentioned, then, and if coffee drinking is also there, you could look for correlations at the individual level. I would say stomach cancer, this would not be a good design because there's probably not going to be many cases of it in the CCHS data. Ulcers, maybe, who knows. And a case control design would be to look for new cases of stomach ulcers in a defined period, so maybe all the new cases in the next 6 months at such and such clinic, and then a comparable control group, and ask those people about their coffee consumption. So that's sort of one example in the different designs. All right, so we've been through these types of studies, so the ecologic, case control, and cross-sectional. The last type of observational study is a cohort. So far in the ecologic studies, we've seen that they can be quick and cheap. They're a good first step, but they're imprecise, and you have this issue of the ecologic fallacy. Cross-sectional studies are a single snapshot. They give you the prevalence, not the incidence. And you can't really use them to study rare diseases, and you definitely can't establish causality. And then in case control studies, these can be quick and cheap. You need smaller samples as compared to a big cross-sectional study. You could use them to look for rare diseases, but again, you can't address the temporality, and it's an indirect estimate of risk. So this is where you can do a cohort study to figure out our chicken and the egg. So again, it's the temporality issue that's always difficult. So cross-sectional and case control study designs are based on an exposure and a disease information that's collected at the same time. So this is efficient because you can do it all at once, but it's not good for looking at temporality, and it can be challenging sometimes to interpret the results. There's been no actual lapse of time in these study designs between when you measure the exposure and the disease. If you are trying to look at things that happened in the past, then you always have the issue of recall bias. How well do people actually recall their previous exposures? And something we haven't covered yet, but none of those previous designs are useful really for uncommon exposures. So in a case control study, you can look at an uncommon outcome. You can go and specifically cherry pick those people. But if it's an uncommon exposure that you're looking at, sort of none of these have really addressed that. So that's where cohort studies can be useful. They can address issues of temporality because we're going to follow people forward in time. They also can address recall bias because we'll capture data on a prospective basis as it happens. And it also can be used to look at rare exposures. So we could start out with a group of people that have a particular exposure that we're interested in. This is again an observational and analytic study. We are again going to use individual data. And the key thing about this type of study is that it's a group or a cohort that's followed over time. So we make multiple observations as opposed to that one snapshot in a cross-sectional study. This is also the only study design that lets you look at multiple outcomes. So in a case control, we're defining our cases on one particular outcome, but in a cohort study, you could look at multiple. So I mentioned the child study is a cohort that I work with. We're looking at asthma and allergy, but we're also looking at other outcomes because that design allows us to do that. Sometimes you'll hear to cohort studies, you'll hear them referred to as follow-up studies because you follow people up. And so you start with a group or a cohort of people who do not have your outcome of interest, that's key, but who are at risk for that outcome. And then you include at least 2 observation points. Many studies use many more than that to determine exposure status and eligibility, and a second or more to determine the number of incident cases. So you're capturing incident cases.
Sorry, what does at risk mean? How do you define that?
So, meaning that they can develop the outcome. So an extreme example would be that men are not at risk of breast cancer.
Okay, so instead of at risk, it's like has the potential to develop.
Yeah, and so in some cases that's pretty obvious, but in other cases it might be actually less obvious. If you're including people in your study that are never at risk of the outcome to begin with, you might get kind of a bias.
Okay, so it's not like at increased risk, it's just
No, just
in general,
yeah,
could develop.
Could develop, right, yeah.
It's viable to believe that outcome.
Yeah. Sweet.
So in this pictorial way, we have here we're starting with exposed and unexposed people in 2 separate kind of groups. We're documenting their exposures and then seeing which ones develop the outcome moving forward. So this addresses temporality, and we can think of this as going from cause to effect. It's still an observational study, so we can't always prove causality, but we're at least moving in that forward direction. It permits us to calculate incidence rates, so the development of new cases. And we can investigate multiple exposures. So comparing the case control to a cohort, if you think of it this way, we're starting in the present. In a case control study, we define our cases and controls and we look backwards at their exposures. In a cohort study, we start from the exposure and then go forward to define the cases. Now you will hear of a prospective cohort or a retrospective cohort. And so the difference there's still always, the cohort studies are always following forward in time. But in one case, for a prospective cohort, we'd start today and we'd follow people forward in the future. In a retrospective cohort, we could actually use data that already exists. So for example, at the Center for Health Policy, they have records going back many years. So you could go back 20 years, start then, and follow all those people forward in time by looking through their records. And that would be a retrospective cohort, but they both still go forward in time. Which is what that says. So in a prospective cohort, we follow from present to future. We can do direct exposure measurements. So whether that's blood pressures as an exposure or carbon dioxide levels in a home, we can measure those directly. In the retrospective cohort, we start from the past and work up to the present. We have to then rely on historical data for the exposures. So if there were blood pressure measures in that person's file, then we could get them, but if they weren't measured, then we couldn't. So we're a bit restricted there to what's available. However, it's saving us a lot of time to use historical data. So the prospective cohorts are, of course, very slow because we have to wait for diseases to develop. Retrospective cohorts can be much quicker. And the prospective cohort is really the best and most direct evidence for a cause and effect relationship because you know for sure that your exposures happened first, you captured them on a prospective basis, you're confident in those data, and then you capture the outcomes later. The retrospective cohort is a bit of a compromise because you still do get that forward-looking data, but it's done retrospectively, so you don't have complete control over the data you're capturing. So sampling strategies for cohort studies. You could do a population-based cohort, which is looking at an entire population or a representation of an entire population. Or you could do an exposure-based cohort if you're interested in a particular exposure. So for example, exposure to working in a mine. You could look at a group of miners, they could be your cohort, you could follow them forward to see what effect that exposure has. A birth cohort is individuals born in the same year or time period, and that could be population-based or exposure-based. So it could be the child study is kind of representative of Canada, but you might do a birth cohort of people born to minors, for example, or people born in a particular, with a particular exposure. So one very famous study, has anyone heard of the Framingham study? So this is a cohort study done in Framingham, Massachusetts. It's still ongoing, but it started in 1948, and they've had over 2,200 papers published out of their study, so pretty productive. They started with a random sample of 6,500 adults free of heart disease, because that was their outcome of interest, so people without the outcome. And they targeted the age range of 30 to 59 years and followed those people forward in time. They actually now have second and third generations, so they have the offspring, the Framingham offspring, and I don't know what the next one's called, the Framingham offspring. But they're continuing to study, and they discovered so many of the common risk factors that we know of today for heart disease, like elevated blood pressure, cholesterol, were discovered in this study. So they found from following and monitoring these factors that they were the ones that became that stood out as being most associated with heart disease later on. This is one paper from the Framingham Heart Study in 1962. So they say here, evidence has been presented demonstrating that elevated serum cholesterol, blood pressure, obesity, smoking, low vital capacity all increased with the risk of developing coronary heart disease. So I think these are things that we all take for granted now. They were discovered in this study. They actually thought before that oh, your blood pressure, it just gets higher as you get older, that's just normal. Now we know that it's a sign of disease. So this is, of course, my favorite cohort, the child study. And I've talked about it already, but this is one of the papers that we published last year. So looking at the artificial sweetener consumption in pregnancy as our exposure. So again, in a cohort, you can look at many exposures. So this is one we picked up on. So looking in this table at artificially sweetened beverages, so classifying the moms into whether they consume them less than once a month, less than once a week, all the way up to once per day. And then looking at the proportion of infants who are overweight by a year of age. And then here we have odds ratios, and we've got the crude ones and then the adjusted ones. So here's an example where you can see for moms who consumed artificially sweetened beverages every day during pregnancy, they were 2.4 times more likely to have an infant who is overweight by 1 year of age. And that's significant because you can see the confidence interval doesn't cross 1. Our reference group here is the moms who consume them rarely or never. And then when we adjusted for maternal BMI, you can see that effect estimate gets a little bit lower, meaning that the BMI was sort of was confounding that association. It gets lower still when we adjust for other covariates, but it's still significant. So that's one example. So considerations for cohort studies is the availability of exposure data. So especially if you're doing a retrospective cohort, you're stuck on what's available. If you're doing prospective, then you have some leeway to design what exposure data you want to collect. The size and cost. So these can be extremely costly studies to be following thousands of people over many years. It depends, of course, on how frequently you contact them or have them come in and what kind of assessments you do. The data collection and management. You can amass a large amount of data, so managing all of that can be a challenge. And then follow-up is a big one for cohorts. So it's of course best if you recruit your 3,000 people and then see them all every year, but inevitably some people drop out or you can't find them. And the more that happens, the more at risk you are of having bias in your sample. So if it's random, if people drop out at random, then your power goes down because you have less people, but that's not such, that's the main problem. But often it's not random, so it's often it's the most sick people or the people at lowest socioeconomic status who are most likely to drop out, and that means you're missing a certain portion of your population. So in cohort studies, we often look at relative risk instead of an odds ratio. So this is a direct measure of association between your exposure and outcomes. The odds ratio that we looked at in case controls is an indirect estimate of that association. So in a relative risk, we're looking at the ratio of incidence or risk of your outcome in the exposed group compared to the non-exposed. So a table that looks pretty similar to the other one we saw. Instead of looking at the odds of exposure, we're looking at the risk of disease. And so it's calculated this way. And if we did an example, so looking at lung cancer in smokers and non-smokers, so a pretty classic one. So we have, so we look first at the risk of cancer in the smokers, the exposed group. So we have 114 of the smokers out of the total amount, which is 565. So we calculate that, and it's 0.2. And then the risk of cancer in the unexposed, so 37 out of this total amount, and that's 0.02, and the ratio between those is 7.7. So we'd interpret that as smokers being 7.77 times more likely to develop lung cancer. So very similar to the odds ratio, if you have a relative risk of 1, that implies there's no association. If it's greater than 1, that means that you have a risk factor. If it's less than 1, you have a negative association or a protective factor. And we again look at the confidence intervals to judge statistical significance. And just like with odds ratios, we can do adjustments for other factors in statistical models. So the pros and cons of a cohort study. The advantages are that you do get a direct estimate of risk. You can look at the time sequencing, that's a big advantage of the exposure and outcome. And you can study multiple outcomes, and you can study rare exposures. So the disadvantages, the big one is that it takes a really long time. It can be costly, and you have to deal with issues of loss to follow-up. So, you probably knew this was coming. Think about now cohort design for your question.
The question really is, I'd love to
go back 10 years. And then forward to now.
Or like, do it
It's very rare that you can
before you,
before like
Because it's more recent.
like you do a pregnancy test at the beginning.
Oh, it's always better, I mean, it's always better to go forward, it's just, that means you're also leaving 15, 20 years chance.
Whereas the present now is
But it turns out like the child study,
So it would be like,
would have
it would be like
information,
an
so
applying, it would be like
coordinate with child studies, or go back to a certain age, a certain year, who was born. They have that accurately, so you're very waiting 15, 20 years, you're waiting.
or like have their child look at that on their birthday or something.
You're programs, where we get a program.
And
Right, the house is pretty makes sense.
Yeah, but we don't really need to.
It's not, you would pick more.
We can look at it.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I got accurate, though again, I don't know what they're saying.
But like, we really.
Did you guys get that vaccine here? Or were we too old for it?
HPV, I was too old. And they definitely weren't doing boys.
Yeah.
it was just,
Now.
No, everybody. It is great, so. Yeah. Which is like.
and asked us stuff.
So what?
At your point though.
So boys.
I know, like, it's not a
Or is that just one of the exposures, right? And then like, oh, I should be good, just to pick it
Well, you're just like, what we
Yeah, they didn't start doing it till after, like,
It's not
it's really quick. They do it in like the fifth grade. They do it in, and I think that was in either high school or university.
there's no reason to,
My younger sisters.
like, the HPV vaccine.
All right, we good? Start on this side.
So we're going to use the same usage function that we had before. And we'll take all the kids that are going into 1117 and then categorize them into extreme friends, term, and closed states. And then we're going to follow them until we're 50.
And or we'll get to know you guys and ask if we can link in with your child's cohort.
Yeah, good.
Which is probably what would actually happen.
We have the prospective option. Prospective option.
And for the retrospective, we're going to just gender, age, maybe SES.
We do. So you also could look at, so the Center for Health Policy, they have health data, but they also have some school data linked in. So you could go back 15 years, find the gestational ages, and then link with their, like they have EDI, which is the Early Development Instrument in kindergarten. So you could look